The night a violent storm tore through my town, I found a 4-month-old baby abandoned on my doorstep. My wife looked at him and whispered, "That child is bad luck. He will destroy this family." But I ignored her and raised that little boy as my own for 18 years. Then he left to build a future, and I never heard from him again. 22 years later, my own son turned against me and used the law to take my home. As deputies arrived with legal papers, a corporate helicopter landed outside, and a man stepped forward saying, "Dad, don't worry, I'm home." The coffee had gone cold before I managed even that first sip. I registered it the way you register small things on mornings, when something lodged deep in your chest already knows what is headed your way before your mind has caught on. I was at the kitchen table on Crestwood Mill Road, both hands wrapped around the mug, watching the last thread of steam dissolve into nothing. Through the window, the garden I hadn't so much as glanced at, in 3 years lay in the flat, October light, dry and brown, and still holding its patience the way only a neglected thing can. Welcome to Honor Revenge Stories, a place where real family truths get told with the honesty they deserve. If stories like this one speak to you, I'd be glad to have you along for more. Just hit follow so the next one finds you. Before we go any further, tell me, is it morning, where you are afternoon, or are you up late with nothing but the quiet and this story? I always wonder who's listening and when. A note worth mentioning, some details in this story have been shaped for the telling, and any resemblance to specific living people is purely coincidental. What matters is the truth underneath the story, and that part is very real. 66 years old that morning, 31 years in that house. I had the place memorized the way you memorize a person, not by thinking about it, but by living inside it long enough that every quirk becomes part of you. The third porch step gave under your foot with a low complaint. The kitchen pipes rapped twice before the hot water surrendered itself. The front gate dragged across the concrete if you let it swing wide. That morning, when I heard that drag, I looked out and found Ruthie Alton planted on her side of the fence. 24 years she had been my neighbor, and I had never once caught her standing like that, arms locked across her chest, face tight with something she couldn't say out loud. She kept cutting her eyes down the street, then back at my door, then down the street again, the way a person looks when they have seen the end of something coming and know there is nothing left to do about it. 2 cars nosed around the corner onto Crestwood Mill Road, a black sedan, out front unhurried and deliberate, a county sheriff's cruiser, trailing it with its light bar dark. They settled in at the curb without any ceremony, the way people do when they have run this errand enough times that it no longer requires performance. I put the mug down. My hands were still. That surprised me. Derek walked in through the front door without a knock. He had a key one I'd handed him 2 Christmases back, because he was my son, and that was what fathers did with sons they trusted. He was 29, dressed in a pressed blue shirt, and he didn't come alone. Beside him was a man I'd never seen before, Clifton Rowe. A business card materialized on my kitchen table half a minute later. Attorney at law, 4 sheriff's deputies fanned out behind them through the kitchen and living room, moving with a kind of practiced ease that told you they understood something. The rest of us sometimes forget that simply occupying a room is its own species of force. One took up a spot near the front door. Another planted himself at the hallway entrance. The other 2 flanked Clifton Rowe, hands loose at their sides, eyes doing that thing that trained eyes do, seeming to rest on nothing while actually accounting for everything. Constance came in behind all of them. She went to the far wall of the kitchen and stopped there, arms down, gaze fixed somewhere over my left shoulder, like she had found a mark on the wall worth studying. She would not meet my eyes. "Dad," Derek said. He drew out the chair across the table and lowered himself into it, back to rigid posture, too composed, all of it too practiced, and something in my stomach turned over. "I need you to listen to me." "I'm listening," I said. Clifton Rowe unlatched a leather folder and arranged a stack of documents between us. The pages were dense with the kind of legal language that isn't meant to be understood so much as it is meant to be accepted. "Mr. Grady," he began, his voice carrying the careful flatness of a man who has taught himself not to inflect when the news is bad. "I represent your son Derek Grady in a petition filed before the Riverside County Superior Court under California Probate Code, Section 1800. The court has granted a temporary conservatorship of your estate, effective as of last Monday. We are here this morning to carry out the terms of that order." I looked at the documents. I looked at Derek. I looked at Constance, still absorbed by whatever was above my shoulder. "A conservatorship," I said. "What it means..." Derek said, his voice fraying slightly before he caught hold of it again, "is that I'll be overseeing your finances and your living situation for the time being, Dad. The court determined it's in your best interest." My best interest. I rolled those 3 words around and found they had the taste of something ordered on my behalf without anyone asking what I wanted. There is also a placement order. Clifton Rowe eased a separate sheet across the table. A residential care facility in Corona has been arranged. Excellent staff. Derek has visited the property himself. I kept my eyes on that page. Through the kitchen window, Ruthie's voice reached me in pieces. She was on her phone working through a list of numbers, her voice climbing a little each time a call went unanswered. Derek shifted forward, and for a moment, the surface cracked, and I saw what was underneath, something that resembled pain. The pain specifically of a man who has rehearsed his own justifications so thoroughly that he's stopped noticing the effort it takes to keep believing them. "Dad," his voice fell low, "I know how this feels, but you've been letting things slip. You're alone in this house, and that is not all right, and I am doing this because I love you. Please just sign the placement agreement. It goes easier when you sign." Clifton Rowe drew a pen from inside the folder and extended it toward me. I stared at it. I was thinking about the last time I had sat at this table with a pen in my hand, when I had sat down in my own, writing the names of every person I cared about, each one deliberate, each one chosen. One name in particular came back to me. The night I first wrote it down, it had been on a smaller piece of paper, folded into quarters, pressed into the palm of an 18-year-old boy who stood at the foot of this driveway with a suitcase so light it was almost an insult to the weight of what he was carrying away from this place. I reached out and took the pen, held it above the signature line. My hand, which had been perfectly steady all morning, was no longer steady. A tremor had moved into my fingers, not from fear, but from the particular kind of shaking that overtakes a person when one part of them is pulling in one direction and every other part is pulling somewhere else. Then I put the pen back on the table. "No," I said. Derek's jaw went tight. "Dad?" "No." Same word, same register. I pressed both palms flat to the tabletop until the shaking stopped. "I am not putting my name on that paper, Derek." A stillness settled over the kitchen, all except Ruthie's voice filtering through the window, which had descended now into a low fraying murmur, the sound of someone who has run through every number they know. Then from the south I heard it, the same sound that had reached me earlier that morning, without my understanding what it was. Now it was close, very close. The window panes shivered faintly in their frames. Derek wheeled toward the sound first. The deputy by the door stepped outside, looked skyward, and when he came back in, every trace of official composure had drained from his face. "Sir," he said, "there's a helicopter. It's coming down, it's setting down next door." To make sense of why I didn't push back harder that morning, you have to go back 22 years to a night when the sky above Cedar Hollow felt like it was coming apart at the seams. November, there doesn't ease in. It arrives behind wind that pours down off the San Gabriel Mountains and works at every hinge and shutter on the property. That November, it came backed by a storm that had spent 3 days gathering itself before it finally unloaded. The sound on the roof wasn't quite rain. It was more as though the sky had made a decision to empty itself completely and had no particular interest in what lay beneath it. Constance had turned in early. A headache had sent her to bed before 9. Derek was 7 down the hall, his nightlight leaking a thin orange bar under the door. I was at the kitchen table with the tail end of a pot of coffee, watching the glass turn opaque with running water, when something caught my ear. My first thought was the wind working its way through a gap in the eaves. My second thought was the cat, a black and white stray that Constance did not want fed, and that I fed anyway when she was not looking. But it wasn't the wind and it wasn't the cat. I pulled the front door open and the storm threw itself at me, cold, deafening, carrying the smell of soaked earth. There on the porch just left of the door sat a wicker market basket. Inside it, bundled in a cotton quilt that was already soaked through at the corners, lay a baby boy, 4 months old if that. His face was clenched and flushed from crying, both small fists drawn up tight against his chest. When the light from inside reached him, his eyes opened and he looked up at me with the wide, unanchored gaze of someone who has held on through a very long wait and still isn't certain it has ended. Folded once and tucked near his chin was a slip of paper. I pulled it free with fingers the cold had already made clumsy. 3 words. That was the whole of it. "Please take care of my son." No name, no number, no accounting for why someone would set a child down on a stranger's porch in the middle of a November storm and vanish back into the dark as though they had never drawn breath. I stood in that open doorway with rain driving in sideways and a baby looking up at me from the basket, and without a single moment of deliberation, I knew he was coming inside. I got him to the kitchen, shouldered the door shut against the weather, and started peeling away the soaked layers. His skin held the kind of cold that tightens your own chest, when you feel it, that deep animal alarm that tells you something is wrong and you are the one who has to fix it. A dry dish towel was the best I could do in the moment. I wrapped him in it and pulled him against me while I tried to think where to find something warmer. That was when Constance appeared in the doorway. She had heard the door. She stood there in her robe, hair-loose eyes still narrowed from sleep. And when her gaze landed on whatever I was holding against my chest, her whole face went taut in an instant. "Russell," she said. "What is that?" "Someone left him on the porch." "It's left him?" She said it the way you repeat a thing, when you need it to be something other than what it is. In a basket, there was a note. I held the paper out. She read it. Her jaw tightened. Then she folded it precisely in half and handed it back with the deliberate care of a woman returning something she wants no claim over. "Call the police," she said. "Call them right now, Russell, and get them to bring it to the proper authorities." "Him," I said. "Not it. He is cold, Constance. He has been sitting out in that rain, and he is cold, and I am going to warm him up before we talk about anything else." Her eyes went flat. She pulled her arms across her chest, and her voice settled into that particular register she used when the decision was already made and she was just waiting for me to realize it. "That child is not our problem," she said. "We don't know where it came from. We don't know what it carries. You bring a stranger's baby into this house, and you open a door you will not be able to close again. And I am telling you right now, Russell Grady, that child is bad luck. Mark my words. It will destroy this family." Down the hall, Derek's door opened. He shuffled into the kitchen in his pajamas, blinking against the light, and went still when he saw what was in my arms. He was 7 years old, and 7-year-olds have a gift for reading the temperature of a room. What he read made him press his back against the door frame and study the baby with an expression that was neither curiosity nor warmth, but something more tangled than either. "Who is that?" he asked. "We don't know yet," I said. "Is it staying?" Neither Constance nor I said anything. That silence was its own answer, and all three of us felt it. I turned away from Constance then. Not out of anger, I wasn't angry. I turned away because there are certain decisions that don't arrive as choices. They arrive as recognitions, and you cannot argue with a recognition any more than you can argue with the weather. I went to the bedroom, laid the baby carefully in the center of the bed, and pulled open the closets looking for the box of Derek's old baby things Constance had stored on the top shelf, and that I hadn't laid a hand on in 7 years. My hands were unsteady as I lifted it down. Not from the cold, from something harder, to name some mixture of the strangeness of that night, and the understanding already fully formed of what was taking shape. I found a blanket soft yellow, still carrying the faint ghost of baby powder, after all that time, and wrapped him in it properly. By then, he had gone quiet. He was watching me with those wide, dark eyes, and one hand had worked free of the cloth fingers, spreading open, reaching toward nothing in particular. I brought my index finger down to his palm. He closed his fingers around it and held on. That was the moment. Not the note, not the storm, not Constance's warning, or Derek's stare, or any of the reasonable considerations a sensible person might have weighed. That small, blind, instinctive grip, that refusal to let go, was what settled it. Looking more carefully at him, then I noticed something I had missed in the dim light of the doorway. A thin silver bracelet circled his wrist, delicate as a strand of thread, size so small it could only have been put there on purpose, and very recently. There was an engraving on it. I tilted his wrist toward the bedside lamp and leaned in close, but the letters were too fine, and the light too weak to make them out. I told myself I would look in the morning. I did not know then that it would be 8 more years before I finally understood what those letters said. I gave him the name Caleb on the 3rd morning. Not because I had reached some formal resolution about his future, not because paperwork had been filed or a social worker had visited, or Constance had shifted her position. None of that had happened yet. I named him Caleb because on the 3rd morning he woke before first light and began to cry. And I went in and lifted him and stood at the window while the sky moved through its changes, black to gray, to the thin pale gold of an early California dawn. And it felt wrong to keep saying the baby when he was plainly already a person with strong views about what hour of the morning deserved his full attention. "Caleb!" I said aloud to hear how it landed. He stopped crying and looked up at me. All right then, Caleb it was. The months that followed were not simple, and I won't pretend otherwise. Ms. Vera Quill from the Riverside County Department of Children and Family Services came to the house 4 days after the storm. A woman in her 40s, reading glasses on a beaded chain, a folder thick enough to suggest she had seen every version of every situation, at least twice. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and asked questions in a voice that had been professionally trained in kindness, the kind of kindness that is learned through long practice not to become attached. "Mr. Grady, are you aware that California law requires anyone who takes in an abandoned child to report the matter to the county within 72 hours? "I wasn't aware of that specific number," I said, "but I am reporting it now." She looked at me over the rims of her glasses. "You are reporting it on day 4. "Yes, ma'am." She wrote something in the folder. Then she looked over at Caleb, who was lying in the wicker market basket I had lined with the yellow blanket, waving both fists at the ceiling with tremendous focus. And something in her face shifted subtle as a door moving, when someone on the other side leans quietly against it. The formal adoption took 14 months. 14 months of home visits and background checks and court appearances and documents with signature lines that had to be pointed out to me more than once. When it was finished, Caleb Grady was my son in every way the state of California could recognize, and I was legally his father. That piece of paper felt both entirely necessary and entirely beside the point. Constance signed what needed signing. She never told me why she did, and I never asked. There are understandings that a marriage reaches without a single word being exchanged, and that was one of them. In those early years, I worked harder than I ever had. I picked up extra repair jobs on weekends. 3 nights a week, I drove 40 minutes to a machine shop in Moreno Valley to take on overflow work. There were Fridays when I sat down in the armchair after supper and didn't stir again until Saturday morning. But I was never too worn out to go to Caleb when he cried, never too worn out to read to him at bedtime, never too worn out for the particular pleasure of watching a small person discover that the world is bigger and more interesting than it seemed the day before. Derek was 15 by the time Caleb was old enough to be real company. And 15 is an age that has no use for company of any kind, especially a brother 8 years younger who draws attention simply by being present. Derek wasn't cruel to Caleb. He treated him more like a piece of furniture that had appeared in the house without announcement, and that he had decided on the principle to ignore. Caleb, for his part, watched Derek the way he watched most things, from a careful remove, those dark eyes taking steady measure of whatever they landed on. He had been serious since the night I found him, and that seriousness only sharpened as he grew. By the time he was 6, he had disassembled and put back together my old transistor radio without being asked. At 7, he taught himself the fundamentals of coding from a library book with a broken spine that he hauled everywhere until the pages began to detach. By 8, he was doing things with a borrowed laptop that I couldn't track and didn't fully understand, but that made Mrs. Loretta Crane stop me in the parking lot of Cedar Hollow Elementary one that October afternoon, with the look of a woman who has come across something unexpected and hasn't yet decided how to hold it. "Mr. Grady," she said, slightly breathless, as though she had been waiting on this conversation and had moved quickly to reach me. "I need to talk to you about Caleb." She was his 3rd-grade teacher, a tall woman in her 50s with silver hair she kept pinned back and the particular energy of someone who has spent 30 years inside classrooms and still finds children capable of surprising her. "Is something wrong?" I asked. "Something is very right," she said. "That's what I need to talk to you about." She had put Caleb's name forward for the Riverside County Gifted and High Ability Learner Program. The program required a complete background file, academic records, health history, and for children without full birth documentation, an inventory of personal effects the child had arrived with. Routine, she explained. They needed to catalog any identifying items. I brought in the yellow blanket, the folded note, and the silver bracelet. 3 weeks later, the bracelet came back with a report from the county identification office. A single page, a seal at the top, 2 lines of text. I read it standing at the kitchen counter, still in my work clothes grease from the afternoon's last job still on my hands. The engraving read, "WT for Caleb." The report stated that WT matched the registered trademark of Whitmore Technologies, a privately held technology firm headquartered in Seattle, California. The bracelet had been custom-made by a jeweler in Capitol Hill. Records showed it had been commissioned by a Nathan Halcott approximately 5 years prior for a child named Caleb. Nathan Halcott. I read that name twice. Then I kept reading. The report stated that Nathan Halcott and his wife Sylvie had been killed in a vehicle accident on Highway 101 in March of 2002, 8 months before the night of the storm. They had left behind an infant son whose whereabouts were listed as unknown in the probate proceedings that followed. I set the paper on the counter. My chest felt like something solid and heavy had been pressed onto it from outside. Caleb was in the living room. I could hear him talking to himself, that low, even murmur he made when he was working through a problem logic feeling its way toward a conclusion. He was 8 years old, and he had his mother's eyes. I didn't know that then. I had never seen a photograph of Sylvie Halcott, but I know it now. He was the rightful heir to a company I had never heard of, and he was doing his homework on my living room floor, and those two facts refused to sit comfortably beside each other in my mind. I was still standing at the counter, the report in my hand, when I heard the back door open. Through the kitchen window I saw Constance in the yard, phone to her ear, her back turned toward the house. Her voice was low and deliberate, the voice of someone selecting each word the way you select each step on unsteady ground. "Yes," she was saying. "The boy is still here. His name is Caleb Grady now. He has the bracelet." A pause. "I thought you should know." My grip tightened around the report until the page creased. She had known before the school submitted the forms, before the county sent the bracelet off for identification, before I had come home with grease on my hands and read 2 lines that reshaped everything. Constance had already known, she had already made her call, and she had not said a single word to me about any of it. I stood at that counter a long time, the paper in my hand, Caleb's voice drifting in from the living room, steady and unhurried, working through whatever he had decided to solve that afternoon. The black car came on a Tuesday in October, 6 years after that evening at the kitchen counter, 6 years during which I had not confronted Constance about the phone call I had watched through the window. I had turned it over in my mind on ordinary evenings, studying her face across the dinner table. But some conversations once opened cannot be closed again, and I had not yet found the version of that one that didn't end with something breaking permanently. So I had waited. And now a black car was rounding the corner onto Crestwood Mill Road, moving with the unhurried certainty of a vehicle that expects to be received wherever it arrives, whether or not it was invited. Caleb was in the driveway when it pulled up, shooting free throws at the hoop I had mounted above the garage door 7 years earlier. He was 14, all arms and legs. The moment the car appeared, he stopped, ball resting against his hip eyes, tracking it with that careful measuring look he had carried since he was old enough to have one. 2 men climbed out. The first was Gordon Halcott, late 50s, silver at his temples, wearing a suit that cost more than my truck. The second was younger, carrying a leather briefcase with the posture of a man hired to carry things, and to say nothing while doing it. "Mr. Grady," Gordon Halcott said, extending his hand at the gate. The grip was firm and brief. "My name is Gordon Halcott. I believe we have something important to discuss." We sat on the porch. Constance brought out a pitcher of water that nobody touched. She settled into the corner chair, hands folded in her lap, face arranged into an expression of careful neutrality she had spent years refining. Gordon Halcott spoke plainly and without unnecessary softening, which I respected even as each thing he said landed in my chest like something dropped from a considerable height. Nathan and Sylvie Halcott had died on a Wednesday morning in March of 2002 on a curve of Highway 101 south of Cannon Beach, where the guardrail had not been maintained and the overnight rain had left the road slick in a way that the morning sun had not yet had time to correct. Their son, 4 months old, had been in a temporary nanny's care at the time of the accident. In the weeks of upheaval that followed, the child had passed through 2 emergency placements before dropping out of county records altogether. The family had been looking for 8 years. "We believe Caleb is Nathan's son," Gordon Halcott said. He reached into the briefcase and placed a photograph on the porch railing between us. A man in his 30s laughing at something outside the frame, dark eyes bright with whatever the joke had been. The resemblance is difficult to argue with, and the bracelet confirms it beyond any reasonable question. My eyes moved to Caleb, who had come up from the driveway at some point, without my noticing, drawn by the sound of his own name. He was standing just inside the screen door, one hand flat against the mesh, his face doing something I had never seen it do, cycling through expressions faster than I could name them, like a person trying on coat after coat in a cold room searching for one that fits. He was looking at the photograph. "Dad," he said. His voice broke clean through the middle on that single word, and he pressed the heel of his hand hard against his sternum, as though trying to hold something in place. Dad, that man has my eyes. My throat closed so sharply it was almost pain. I looked at the photograph, then at Caleb, then back. The boy was right. The same dark eyes, the same slight downward pull at the outer corners, the look I had studied across the breakfast table for 14 years without ever knowing where it had come from. Yes, I said, he does. Gordon Halcott cleared his throat quietly. Caleb is the sole heir to Nathan and Sylvie's estate, which includes their controlling interest in Whitmore Technologies. There are legal steps involved, of course, but the family's position is clear. He belongs with us. He belongs with us. Those 4 words. I felt Caleb's gaze find my face, and I kept every muscle in it from moving, because what was running underneath was moving plenty. My pulse was beating hard against the inside of my chest, like something trying to break through, and my hands had the arms of the porch chair in a grip that was making my knuckles white. When Gordon Halcott and his lawyer finally left, 2 weeks, they said before they'd return with the paperwork, Ruthie materialized at the fence. She'd been out in her garden, or performing the idea of being in her garden, which was how she stayed close to a situation without inserting herself into it. She studied me from her side of the fence with a look full of unspoken questions. She was decent enough not to voice. I gave her a small shake of the head. Nothing to say yet. Then the screen door swung open and Caleb walked out. He came and stood right in front of me. The skin around his eyes was pink, his jaw locked in that particular way. It locked when he'd made a decision not to cry, and the decision was already slipping. "Dad," he said, "does any of this change anything between you and me?" The ache that moved through my chest at that was the kind you have to breathe around before you can speak through it. I lowered myself onto the porch step and touched the wood beside me. Caleb sat down. Together, we looked out over Crestwood Mill Road, the Tuesday afternoon preceding. Without us a neighbor out with a dog, a kid rolling past on a bicycle, the world going on, as though nothing of any consequence had just been placed on this doorstep. "Not one single thing," I said. Caleb gave a single nod. With the back of his wrist, he went roughly at his eyes, a boy's way of announcing that this moment wasn't going to get the better of him. He settled his shoulder against mine, the way he had since he was little enough to tuck under my arm, and we sat there in the shifting afternoon light with nothing more needed between us than that. There are certain words a man speaks once and spends every year afterward handling like something fragile, asking himself whether they were worth what, giving them cost. Mine came on a Tuesday morning in June of 2020 at the same kitchen table where Clifton Rowe had spread his documents 4 years later, beneath the same window, looking out at the same garden I hadn't managed to save from neglect. Caleb was 18 years old. 3 weeks earlier, the Halcott family had come back with a formal proposal, University of Washington in the fall, every dollar covered, and after that, a guided path into Whitmore Technologies leadership up in Seattle. The whole thing was bound in a folder, thick as a reference book. Every page in it was a door I had no way to build for him, not on my wages, not on all the overtime I'd ever pulled, not on any number of surrendered weekends. I lived with that folder for 3 weeks. Read it twice, filed it in the kitchen drawer, took it back out, read it a 3rd time. Then on the Sunday night, before I sat Caleb down, I kept myself awake at the kitchen table, until 2 in the morning, folder open, coffee gone cold, and I arrived at the only choice I'd be able to carry. It wasn't the easy one. It was never going to be the easy one. Caleb came to the table the next morning, still in his work clothes. We'd had a repair job going in the garage. He sat down across from me, looked once at my face, and something in his own face went very quiet and very composed. The look he got when he sensed something hard was on its way, and was making himself ready for it. "You want me to go?" he said, not a question. "I want you to have what's yours," I told him. Those two things aren't always the same. His jaw set. Both hands lay flat on the table, and then slowly they closed into fists. "I don't want their money, Dad. I don't want their company. I want—" He stopped himself, pressed his mouth shut. His eyes were filling, and he was throwing everything he had at keeping them from doing it. "I want to stay here, work alongside you. I don't need what they're offering." "I know you don't need it," I said. "That's beside the point." "Then what is the point?" I stretched my arm across the table and covered his fist with my hand. His knuckles were cold and rigid against my palm. "The point," I said, "is that I didn't raise you to live inside the ceiling of what I could provide. I raised you to clear it. That mind of yours, Caleb, I've been watching it since you were 6 years old, disassembling my radio on the kitchen floor. What's in that head of yours is too large for this county to hold. And if you sit down and stay here on my account, I'll tell you exactly what happens 10 years out when life starts feeling narrower than it ought to. You'll trace it back to this morning. I'd sooner be the reason you left than the reason you didn't." Caleb's face gave way. He snapped his head to the side jaw, working hard, and 2 tears cut quick lines down his face, which he rubbed out immediately with the back of his hand, with a fury that suggested he resented them for showing up. "That isn't fair," he said, the words thick and rough at the edges. "No," I said, "it isn't." He drew his hand free from under mine, got up from the table and crossed to the kitchen window, stood with his back to me. I could see the effort it took in the rise and fall of his shoulders, in the way he pressed one palm flat to the wall above the sink, as though the wall were the thing keeping him upright, the way you brace against something that's larger than you are. He was quiet a long time. Then he turned back around, eyes still red, but his face had been gathered into that fierce, breakable kind of composure that belongs to a person who has decided, once and for all, that this moment will not win. "Okay," he said, one word, flat, finished. The bravest sound I have ever heard a human being make. We filled the rest of that morning, moving around the garage together. No real work getting done, just the old familiar rhythm of 2 people who'd occupied the same space long enough that they'd stopped having to think about where the other one was. At some point, I came across the little wooden box, the one holding the things from the storm, the cotton quilt, the note, the yellow blanket. I put one more thing in, a slip of paper with his address on it, written in pencil in my handwriting, which had never been tidy and had grown worse across the years. 14 Crestwood Mill Road, Cedar Hollow, California. Beneath that, in letters a size smaller just in case. I folded it into quarters and put it into his hand that afternoon when the Halcott family's car pulled up to the gate. Caleb looked down at what I'd given him. Then he reached into the breast pocket of his work shirt and brought something out I hadn't seen him carry in a long time. The silver bracelet wound tight in his palm. He set it in my hand. "Hold on to it for me," he said, "until I come back to get it." The last word broke, just split right open. He came at me with a hug that was harder than either of us expected, and it went on longer than either of us had thought it would. His arms locked around my back, shaking his face down against my shoulder. I held on because releasing him was the thing I'd made up my mind to do, and I needed another few seconds before I could make myself do it. "I'll come back," he said, his voice muffled against me. "I promise, Dad. I promise." "I know," I said. "Go on now." He got into the car. Never looked back. I was grateful for that, because if he had, I don't believe either of us would have held together. The car moved off down Crestwood Mill Road, made the turn at the corner, and was gone from sight. I stayed on the porch until the air settled. Then I went inside. Caleb's coffee cup sat where he'd left it on the table, half full, stone cold. I stood over it a while before I could bring myself to pick it up. From somewhere behind me near the window, I heard Constance let out a breath. Slow, almost silent, the kind of exhale that belongs to a person who has been pressing against something heavy for a very long time and has at last been given permission to stop. I didn't turn around. I took the cup to the sink and tipped the cold coffee out, and I told myself the sting behind my eyes was the morning light cutting through the glass. It was not the morning light. That first letter arrived 3 weeks after he was gone. I know, because I had kept count morning by morning, like a man marking days on a wall. Before coffee, before the garden, before any of the quiet routines that give a day its shape, I was already out at the end of the driveway, barefoot on cold concrete, whatever I had slept in. I lifted the mailbox lid and peered inside with the hopefulness of someone who has not quite admitted even to himself that the waiting may be for nothing. The 22nd morning, something was there. Thin envelope, the address written at a slight angle, the handwriting of a person whose hands know a keyboard better than a pen. In the upper left corner, Caleb Grady, Capitol Hill, Seattle, California. I read those 3 lines standing in the driveway in my undershirt, read them again twice more, then carried the letter inside. Coffee first. Then I sat at the table and opened it with the slow care you give to something you are not sure you will ever hold again. He described the apartment, 1 room over an Italian bakery on Pike Street, the air thick always with roasted garlic and fresh bread. He had made peace with that smell, he wrote, because it meant someone below was always at work, and that felt like a kind of nearness. He wrote about Seattle, too, about the evening fog drifting in off the bay, turning the streetlights into something soft and old, like a scene from a picture made before either of us was born. What he missed about home caught him off guard, he said. Not the things you would expect. The the sound the garage door made, the particular creak of the third porch step, the smell of biscuits on a Sunday morning drifting out of the kitchen. He wrote, "I keep the piece of paper in my shirt pocket. Every morning when I get dressed, I make sure it is there. I do not know why that matters so much. It just does." 4 times I read that letter. Then I folded it with care and laid it in the wooden box alongside the blanket and the note and the bracelet and the linen cloth I had wrapped them in. The second letter showed up 5 weeks on. After that came a third, then a fourth space between them, uneven the rhythm of someone constructing a life and pausing now and then to send word back about how the work is going. It was around the third letter that I began noticing Derek taking it upon himself to bring in the mail. He did it the way he did most things he had thought out in advance, as though it were nothing. He had started appearing on Saturday mornings more regularly since Caleb left, always with some easy explanation for why he happened to be passing through. And at some point during each visit he would mention that he had spotted the mail on his way up and had gone ahead and grabbed it. First time, I gave it no thought. Second time, something registered, though I pushed it aside, told myself I was making something out of a kindness. By the fourth time, I had gone quiet on the subject entirely, because any objection I might raise would make me sound like a man who suspected his own son of a generosity. So, it went on. Envelopes kept landing on the kitchen counter, Derek carrying them in, setting them down. Bills, advertisements, the odd card from someone nearby. I told myself Caleb's letters were in there somewhere, and I was losing them in the shuffle. It was Constance who informed me over dinner one evening that the letters had apparently stopped "said it," the way you mention rain, without looking up from her plate. "Caleb has probably found his footing by now," she said. "People get busy when they're young. You can't expect letters to go on forever." I watched her across the table. She kept eating. "Has he telephoned?" I asked. "Once," Derek said, from the far end. He had been staying for dinner more and more. "You were asleep. I let him know. He said he'd call back." A shrug. I suppose it slipped his mind. That evening I dialed the number Caleb had written inside his first letter. 4 rings, then voicemail, a recorded voice that wasn't his, just the standard message. I left word. Nothing came back. 2 weeks later, I tried again. Derek picked up. "He is in a meeting," Derek told me. "I'll make sure he knows you called Dad." "Why are you answering his telephone?" I asked. A pause brief. "He's got his calls routed to me while he's traveling, for anything urgent. You know how he is." I did not know how he was. That was the entire weight of the thing. But I said, "All right," and put the phone down, and settled into the armchair with the television, dark, just sitting inside the quiet of the house. Then one afternoon, I was rummaging in the kitchen drawer for a pen, the same drawer where I had come across Constance's papers years earlier, and instead, my fingers closed on an envelope. I drew it out. What I saw in the corner made my chest go tight before my heart caught up and started hammering. Caleb Grady, Seattle, California. The flap had already been pulled open. Inside, nothing. The letter was gone, not in the drawer, not anywhere I searched. I stood there holding that hollow envelope and felt something pass through me that I could not put a word to. Something cold. That same week, a letter came in with the rest of the mail set on the counter by Derek. Caleb's name on it addressed to me, but the handwriting was not right. I had 4 letters written in Caleb's hand. I knew his script, a slight forward pitch to every character, the C in Caleb, just a touch oversized, the tail of the Y, pulling long beneath the line. What I was looking at now was rounder, more measured, the work of someone rendering a style from memory rather than living inside it. The letter said Caleb was thankful for everything that he had found where he belonged, that he was looking ahead and wished me well, and that it was likely better for both of them not to pick at the past. I read it a second time. Midway through, my hands were shaking enough that the page trembled visibly, and I had to lay it flat on the table and press both palms down against the wood until they steadied. I reasoned with myself, handwriting shifts over time. Fatigue does it. Distance does it. Hurrying does it. I held on to that reasoning longer than I should have. I placed the letter in the wooden box with the others and went out to the garden that had grown hushed along its outer edges, the far rows going shapeless and untended. I stood until the light had moved, and my legs had stiffened from standing too long without moving. Only when I was certain my face had composed itself did I go back in. Now I need to tell you about something that took place 4 years after Caleb left. Something I only came to know much later through the woman next door, who had been witness to every bit of it from her kitchen window, and had kept it to herself all that time. Ruthie told me on a Tuesday evening. She was at my kitchen table, a cup of tea between her hands. She had given up drinking by then, and her gaze was fixed on the tabletop. She said she had turned this conversation over in her mind 100 times, and it had never once arranged itself the way she planned. "Just say it, Ruthie," I told her, and she did. Caleb came back in the spring of 2024. He made the drive down from Seattle in a car Ruthie had never seen before, a Subaru wagon, dark green, with a small dent above the rear left wheel. He pulled up at the house at 9:45 on a Saturday morning and sat behind the wheel a good while before opening the door. Ruthie had a clear view through her kitchen window. She knew him at once, even with 4 years between them, because his walk had not changed that forward lean of the head, as though some part of him were always arriving a half step ahead of the rest of his body. He was carrying a box, brown cardboard wrapped in twine, not a large one. He stood at the gate for a moment, eyes on the front door, and Ruthie said that even from where she was standing, she could see his chest rise and fall with a breath he was gathering the nerve to take. Derek pulled the door open before Caleb had reached the porch. Ruthie said she could not account for how Derek knew the precise moment to appear, whether he had clocked the car from a window, or whether it was simply the instinct of a man who has been watching for something he hoped would never come. Derek came out and drew the door most of the way shut at his back. From her kitchen window, Ruthie could not make out a single word. What she could read was Derek's body, upright sealed arms folding across his chest within the first 30 seconds. She watched Caleb's posture shift in reply, the way a body shifts when the thing it most dreaded is being confirmed out loud. The exchange was over in under 3 minutes. Caleb set the box on the porch railing. Derek left it there untouched. Caleb looked once at the front door, just the once. Ruthie said the look lasted no more than 2 seconds, but she has never lost it because it was the look of a person calculating whether hope still has any ground to stand on and arriving at an answer they did not want to find. Then Caleb lifted the box again and walked back to his car. I have turned it over many times since why he did not simply knock anyway, why he did not find another route. Caleb told me afterward that he had tried. He called the house number twice from the car that morning. Derek answered both times and told him I was not available. He had searched the neighborhood directory for Ruthie's name and found no listing. He had located the church online but had no direct line for Pastor Elwood, and the general number rang through to a voicemail that Sunday morning without a return call. 3 doors, and Derek had shut every one of them before Caleb ever set foot on the porch. That fact sat badly with me for a long time, because it seemed like something that ought to have been simple to get around. But I think I understand it now. Caleb was 4 months old when someone carried him to a stranger's porch in the dark of a November storm and left him there. He has no memory of it. The mind does not hold what happens to us at 4 months old, but something in the body retains what the mind releases. And beneath everything he constructed for himself, everything he learned and became there, lived a knowledge that had been part of him before he ever had language for it. The knowledge that he could be set down, that he could be left, that the people who were supposed to remain sometimes did not. I spent 18 years offering him evidence to the opposite. I hope it was sufficient. Most of the time I believe it was. But Derek understood precisely which door to open. When the thing you dread most is being unwanted and the first person who ever chose you appears to confirm that fear, you do not reach for your phone, seeking a second opinion. You do not write a note to the neighbor. You know what it would cost to knock on that door and feel it close against you a second time. You already know you could not survive that. So, you walk back to the car. You set the box on the seat beside you and you pull away. Not because you have stopped loving the person inside, but because loving someone and trusting that they love you back are 2 entirely different things. And Derek had just told him in the precise language of a man who had been rehearsing the line that the second thing was no longer on the table. Caleb sat behind the wheel for another long moment. Ruthie said she could see the outline of his shoulders through the glass, and they were not moving the way shoulders move on a person who has settled on leaving. They were the shoulders of someone who had not yet finished deciding. The light in my bedroom was burning. I was inside in the armchair by the window, reading with no knowledge at all that my son was parked 40 feet away in a dark green Subaru wagon with a dent above the rear left wheel and a box of something he had driven 400 miles to bring me. Ruthie nearly called out to him. She told me she had raised her kitchen window and had his name ready in her mouth, and then she stopped herself. She stopped because she did not know what Derek had told him. She did not know what Caleb believed. She was frightened of pulling at something she did not fully understand, and leaving behind a damage she could not undo. So, She stood at her window with his name still in her throat and watched his shoulders finally go still. That quiet, terrible settling that comes when a decision stops being weighed and simply becomes a fact. She did not call out. She has never made her peace with that moment. I told her she should. She said she was working on it. Caleb's car eased away from the curb, with the slowness of a vehicle whose driver is not quite certain he wants to go. It turned at the far end of Crestwood Mill Road and was gone. Ruthie stood at that window for a long time, after looking at the empty street and at the house that did not know what had just driven away from it. I sat with what she had told me for a long while after she finished. My throat was tight. My chest hurt in the particular way it hurts when something has been true for a long time, and you are only just now being permitted to know it, when the outline of a loss you believed you understood turns out to have been larger than you reckoned. "He came back," I said. It came out barely above a whisper, the voice of a man saying a thing aloud for the first time, because speaking it is the only way to make it real. "He came back," Ruthie said. Her eyes had filled, and she made no move to address it. Tears came down her face, and she let them. Her hands tightened around the mug of cold tea, and she looked at me with the expression of a woman who has been carrying something heavy for years and is only now being given permission to put it down. "He came back, Russell. He just never made it through the door." While I was letting the garden run to weeds, Caleb was on the far side of the state, learning what it demands of a person to build something from nothing. I know that now. I did not know it then. He told me later that he drove back to Seattle that Saturday with the box of gifts still on the passenger seat. He could not make himself move it to the trunk, 400 miles with it sitting there beside him. Somewhere on the interstate north of Centralia, he pulled off at a rest stop, hands still on the wheel, and cried the way men cry when they are alone, and certain no one is watching, raw and unguarded, the kind that has been accumulating a long time and does not relent until it has run its course. Then he wiped his face with the back of his hand, merged back onto the highway, and did not pull over again until Seattle. He had Halcott Technologies on paper. The company existed. The inheritance was real, but the board of directors had brought in an interim management team and made their position clear. A 22-year-old without a track record would not be handed the controls of a multi-million-dollar enterprise simply because his surname appeared on the founding documents. He would need to earn it. That was the word they used, earn. So he did. He took a single room in Capitol Hill, picked up a part-time IT support job at a dental office on Broadway Avenue, and put every remaining hour into building a software platform for small business operations management. The first version collapsed on the third day. The second was an improvement, but had no clients. He drained his personal savings in 4 months and had to approach the Halcott board for an advance against his inheritance, a conversation that took something out of him that he never described directly, though I could hear it in the way he talked about it years later. That particular flatness people's voices take on when they are recounting a humiliation they have decided to convert into something useful. He met Nadia Fenton at a startup pitch event in South Lake Union on a Wednesday evening in October. Nadia was 38, a corporate attorney with 15 years behind her, and the kind of concentrated intelligence that made people in rooms instinctively quiet themselves when she asked a question. She was the only one still seated after the event-ended legal pad covered in notes. When Caleb came back for the jacket he had left behind, she looked up and said, "Your pitch was the most interesting one tonight, and also the most poorly structured. Sit down, and I will tell you why." Caleb sat. "Your product is not the problem," she said, tapping her legal pad with the end of her pen. "Your story is the problem. You are asking people to invest in software. You should be asking them to invest in the 10,000 small business owners who are going to save their companies because of it. Do you understand the difference? I think so," Caleb said. "Think faster," Nadia said. "You have about 6 months of runway left, if my math is right, and 6 months is not enough time to think slowly." Her math was correct. She became his attorney, then his advisor, then the person whose judgment he trusted above anyone else's in a professional context. Not because she was always kind, but because she was always precise, and precision was what the situation required. The platform's second version launched in January. Dewey Rafferty, a 50-year-old owner of 3 hardware stores in Tacoma, became the first paying customer after Caleb called him on a Tuesday afternoon and talked for 45 minutes without pause. "Kid," Dewey said at the end of the call, "I have no idea if this thing works, but nobody has ever cared that much about my hardware stores before. I'm in." Growth was slow at first, then steady, then faster than either of them had anticipated. By year's end, Halcott Innovation Group had 40 clients and 2 additional employees beyond Caleb and Nadia. The board took notice in the particular way boards take notice when numbers reverse their direction. And through all of it, tucked in the inside pocket of every jacket he owned, was a piece of paper folded in 4. Some nights he opened it the way another man might open an old letter, just to confirm it was still there, just to read the same 2 lines he had already read 1,000 times. 14. Crestwood Mill Road, Cedar Hollow, California. Just in case. He told me later, he never stopped meaning to return. He kept waiting until he had something worth bringing with him. He had not yet understood that the waiting carried its own price and that certain debts only compound the longer they go unpaid. I turned 66 last March. Ruthie brought over a peach cobbler with the crust slightly uneven on one side, the way homemade baking always is. We ate it on the porch with plastic forks because the good ones had gone missing somewhere in the house. She talked about her sister in Spokane. I talked about the water pump on my truck that had been making a sound I did not trust. It was the best birthday I had managed in years, not because anything remarkable occurred, but because nothing bad occurred either. And at 66, you learn to count that as a kind of victory. The house had grown quieter than it had ever been. Constance had her routines, and I had mine, and we moved through the same rooms with very little collision. 2 people who had been together long enough that the silence between them had ceased to be uncomfortable and had become simply the atmosphere of the place. Derek called on Sundays. He came around every few weeks, always with some purpose, a bill he wanted to go over, a repair he had spotted, a question about the truck. He was attentive in the way that, on good days, made me feel I had raised a son who genuinely cared, and on less good days made me feel I was being checked on. I did not examine that feeling at length. I had learned by 66 that certain feelings are better kept at the edge of your vision rather than brought into focus. By then, the garden had gone to seed all the way to the fence. Each morning, I walked past it and told myself I would get to it when the weather shifted, when my knees let up, when I found some reason to invest effort in growing something again. The reasons kept failing to appear. Pastor Elwood came by on a Wednesday afternoon in September, as he did every few weeks, arriving in his ancient Chevy pickup, with his habit of accepting whatever coffee was available without remark on its quality. He was 70 years old and had served Cedar Hollow Community Church since before I moved to Crestwood Mill Road. He had been at the house the night after the storm, 22 years before the first person I called after I found Caleb. He had sat at this same kitchen table and said, "Russell, I think you just did something that is going to matter a great deal. I am not sure yet to whom." Now he settled across from me with both hands around his mug and regarded me with the unhurried eyes of a man who has spent 50 years hearing things people cannot say to anyone else. "Any word from Caleb?" he asked. "No," I said. He nodded. He did not press. That was among the things I valued most in Pastor Elwood. He understood that some silences are not voids waiting to be filled, but weight that a person has chosen to carry upright. The newspaper had been sitting on the kitchen table for 3 days before I got around to it. The Inland Valley Business Review. Ruthie had set it there when she stopped by on Tuesday, mentioning there was a piece in it she thought might interest me, without specifying which one. I found it on page 7, a profile half a page on the emerging technology sector in California and the companies reshaping it. Halcott Innovation Group appeared in the 3rd paragraph, described as one of the fastest-growing enterprise software firms in the state. There was a photograph. The man in it was in his early 20s, dark jacket, standing before a window, with the Seattle skyline at his back. The caption read, "Caleb Grady, Acting Chairman, Halcott Innovation Group." I lowered myself into the kitchen chair very slowly. He had grown into his height. The boy who had been all arms and legs at 14 had become a man with a particular stillness about him, the stillness of someone who has discovered that rooms will quiet themselves if he simply waits. His eyes in the photograph were the same eyes they had always been, serious, watchful, with that slight downward pull at the outer corners. I studied that photograph for a long time, long enough that my coffee went cold, which seemed to be what coffee did in this house whenever anything of consequence was happening. I needed to be certain before I allowed myself to feel anything. I was not certain. The name matched, but names can match. The eyes matched, but I was 66 years old, reading a small photograph in a newspaper. And I was afraid in a way that surprised me with its force of being wrong, of having spent 22 years holding on to something that turned out to belong to someone else entirely. So I told myself I was not sure. I set the newspaper aside. That was when Derek came in. He entered with the ease of a man who has held a key long enough that he has stopped thinking of it as a privilege, and as he walked into the kitchen, his gaze went directly to the newspaper on the table. The way eyes move toward the thing they have already been turning over in private. He picked it up. He looked at the photograph. Something crossed his face fast enough that I nearly missed it. Not surprise. It was not surprise at all. It was the expression of a man quietly revising his calculations. "Old news," he said, setting it back down. "That company has been around for a while." He folded the paper shut and tucked it under his arm. "Mind if I take this? I wanted to look something up." "Go ahead," I said. He took it. The photograph went with it. I did not ask him to leave it. That evening I opened the kitchen drawer and lifted out the wooden box. I raised the lid and looked at what lay inside the cotton quilt. The note, the yellow blanket, the silver bracelet, and the letter in the wrong hand. I looked at all of it for a long time, my hand resting on the rim of the box without touching anything inside. Then I heard Derek's voice through the wall low, and clipped the tone he used when he was working through something he did not want overheard. "Mom," he said, "we have a problem." I closed the lid. I sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of the house and looked at that closed lid and listened to the silence where Derek's voice had been. And I thought about the man in the photograph with my son's eyes, and I thought about a piece of paper folded in four, and I wondered not for the first time, and not for the last, whether he still had it. What I am about to share next is the part that took longest to sit with, not because it was hard to understand, but because it was hard to accept. Before I get there, I want to ask you something. If you slowly came to realize that someone close to you had been quietly working against you for years, would you confront them the moment you knew, or would you wait and gather every last piece of proof first? My whole life, I have been the man people called when something stopped working, a motor that would not turn over, a fence post rotted at the base after a wet season, water lines that gave out the moment frost came. I understood how to fix things because I understood how things fail. They warn you first if you are paying attention. A smell, a rattle, a temperature that is off by 10 degrees. The skill is learning which signals matter. What I never developed a talent for was detecting deception. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind, the kind that is assembled over months methodically by people moving through your own house with your own trust in their pockets. The full picture came to me much later, drawn out in pieces through Nadia Fenton's inquiry and through Clifton Rowe, who eventually told the county everything once he understood the scope of what he had been engaged to carry out. Here is how it was built as I came to know it. The starting point was my will. Derek had come across it in the kitchen drawer 6 weeks before I ever spotted that newspaper photograph. He was not hunting for it. He had gone looking for the truck's insurance documents, something I had mentioned needed updating. The will happened to be in the same drawer buried beneath a folder of receipts, sealed in a plain envelope bearing my handwriting on the outside. He saw my handwriting and opened it. He would say later that he believed he had a right to its contents. Perhaps. I have rolled that question around for years, and I have yet to land anywhere settled. What is not in question, he read it. He found Caleb's name among the provisions for distribution of assets he drove home. That afternoon he rang his mother. The following Saturday morning, the two of them sat at Constance's kitchen table and arrived at a course of action. I was not there. No one asked me. Their first move was Dr. Arnold Pinkett. Dr. Pinkett was 57 with 2 decades of private psychiatric practice behind him in Corona, and in front of him, a financial situation that had grown ungovernable, a failed investment, a malpractice settlement that had bled him badly, a second mortgage that had quietly become a third. Men in that kind of corner become available to requests they would once have turned away without a second thought. Derek located him through a contact at his gym, which reveals something about the networks through which this variety of arrangement gets made. Derek took me to Dr. Pinkett's office on a Thursday morning in June. A routine checkup, he called it. "You have not seen a doctor in 2 years, Dad," he said, and he was right about that. Just a checkup, nothing to worry about. The office was beige, diplomas and frames. A man across a desk with a yellow legal pad and a watchful quality to his eyes. He put questions to me for 40 minutes, the year, the name of California's governor, whether recent memories gave me any trouble, whether I sometimes lost track of where I was or what I was doing. Every answer I gave was correct. I told him I was well. I said that my memory at 66 was what you'd expect from a man of 66, not from a man coming apart. Dr. Pinkett noted something on the pad and said I had performed very well. He said he would pass along a report to my regular physician. What he passed along instead went to the Riverside County Superior Court, a formal psychiatric evaluation describing what he called early indicators of cognitive decline consistent with mild neurocognitive disorder. The date on that document was 3 weeks before the appointment actually occurred. On the day listed at the top of the page, Arnold Pinkett's license to practice psychiatry in California had already lapsed, 11 days gone. He backdated the evaluation deliberately. He had sat with a man who gave him no grounds for diagnosis, written one anyway, pushed the date backward to a period when he held no legal standing to produce such a document, and filed it with a court. The second component was the power of attorney. A durable power of attorney is a legal instrument giving one person authority over another's financial and legal affairs. The person granting it must sign it themselves with witnesses and a notary. It can be undone at any time by the one who signed. Constance forged my signature. She had rehearsed it. Nadia discovered the evidence afterward, a notebook retrieved from Constance's desk drawer, page after page filled with my name in Constance's handwriting, each attempt edging closer to mine until the gap between them was narrow enough to slip past casual scrutiny. The forged document went to a notary in Hemet, who moved through 40 signatures on a busy day and had no practice of cross-referencing them with financial records. Derek retained Clifton Rowe, a probate and real estate attorney based in Ontario, unblemished record and a habit of not pressing his clients harder than they wanted to be pressed. Rowe brought the conservatorship petition to the Riverside County Superior Court in August. The psychiatric evaluation and the power of attorney filed alongside it as the pillars of the case. The petition alleged that my mental faculties were deteriorating and asked that Derek be placed in legal control of my estate, my money, my property, the roof over my head, pending a formal hearing. The court issued a temporary order in the meantime. That is ordinary practice under California Probate Code. Section 1800 allows temporary conservatorships to move quickly when the documentation presents a compelling picture of need. The court did nothing wrong. A psychiatric evaluation, a signed power of attorney, a son expressing concern, the court received those things and did what courts do. My accounts were frozen. I rang Derek. He said it was a safeguard. I told him I did not require safeguarding. He said the physician had flagged certain concerns that the situation was temporary, that it would all be untangled shortly. His voice never wavered, measured practice, the cadence of a man who had gone over this conversation many times before delivering it. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table and searched my mind for something I had genuinely forgotten. Nothing surfaced. That offered less reassurance than it should have, because when someone tells you your mind is going, the cruelest part is that you must use the very mind in question to decide whether they are right. That evening I went to the wooden box. I lifted the lid. I looked at Caleb's name in the will resting beneath the cotton quilt. I closed the lid again. I sat in the unlit kitchen and let the house hold its silence around me, and I turned over the thought that a man can spend 66 years sharpening his ear for the sounds that broken things make and still go deaf, to the one that was aimed at him until it had nearly finished its work. There is a variety of loneliness that has nothing to do with empty rooms. It lives in full ones. It settles in when the people around you have reclassified you, not as a man, but as a matter requiring management, a risk, something to be held in place until the paperwork catches up. I had been living inside that particular quiet for years. I simply had not yet had a name for what it was. September gave it one. The bank was the first concrete thing I ran into. On a Tuesday morning, I drove out to the branch on Magnolia Avenue needing to pull out $200. There was a water pump required for the truck. The young woman at the counter studied her screen with the controlled expression of someone who has been trained to keep their face from telling the truth, and informed me that my account was subject to a restricted access order and that withdrawals could not be processed. Restricted, I said. Yes, sir. She did not look up. You would need to reach the authorized representative listed on the account. I am the account holder, I said. 31 years I have been the account holder. She lifted her eyes to mine then, and what I saw there was genuine regret, which landed harder than indifference would have. I understand, Mr. Grady, but a court order takes precedence over standard access protocols. There is nothing I can do. I drove back without the money and without the water pump, and pulled into the driveway and sat there a while before I could bring myself to go inside. I rang Derek. It is just temporary, Dad. he said, and there was that practiced evenness in his voice that I had begun to recognize the way you learn to recognize a particular sound from an engine when something inside it has gone wrong. It is a protective measure while the court goes through its review. Nothing to worry about. I will handle the bills in the meantime. I do not need my bills handled, I told him. I need to be able to get at my own money. I hear you, Dad. I know. It will get sorted. He ended the call before I could press him on what sorted meant or when. Over the 2 weeks that followed, I began to see the shape of the thing. The electric bill, which I had paid myself for 31 years, was now being routed to Derek's address. The property tax notice that came in October was made out to Derek Grady, care of this property. When I phoned the county assessor's office to find out why, I was told that a change of correspondence address had been submitted by the authorized conservator back in August. I was the property. Derek was the conservator. These were apparently established facts, and no one had thought to mention them to me. Ruthie noticed before I said a word to her. She appeared at my back door on a Wednesday afternoon, carrying a container of vegetable soup, and wearing the expression of a woman who has worked out what she wants to say, and is still deciding how to begin. "Russell," she said, setting the soup down and turning to face me. "How long has Derek been collecting your mail?" I looked at her. "I have been paying attention," she said. "Not prying watching. There is a difference, and I want you to know I understand the difference." She pulled out a chair and sat down with the kind of decisiveness that means a person has already made up their mind. "He shows up before 8 on some mornings. He empties the box and goes. I have seen it 9 times in the past month." Something tightened in my chest. Nothing to do with my heart, everything to do with the particular ache of having your own slowness confirmed by someone else's sharper eye. "I thought he was being helpful," I said. "I know you did," Ruthie said. "You always assume people are trying to help, Russell. It is one of your finest qualities, and it has cost you more than you know." She reached across and laid her hand over mine. It was warm and dry and steady, the hand of someone who has decided to stop watching from across the way. "I went to see Pastor Elwood yesterday," she said. "I told him what I have been observing. He wants to come by." Pastor Elwood came the following morning. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, both hands around his mug, and he asked me directly, no preamble, whether I knew what a conservatorship was. I told him I did not. He explained it the way he always explained difficult things, plainly, without talking down to me, without filing the edges off until they could no longer cut. A conservatorship, he said, was a legal arrangement in which a court designated someone to oversee the finances and personal affairs of a person judged incapable of managing them on their own. It required a psychiatric evaluation, supporting documentation. It could be granted on a temporary basis while the court completed its review of the full petition. "Derek filed one," Pastor Elwood said. "In August, the court issued the temporary order. I let that sit for a moment. My hands were flat on the table, and I kept my eyes on them the way you fix on something solid when the ground beneath you has become unreliable. Can I contest it?" I asked. "Yes," he said, "but you will need an attorney, an independent one, with no connection to Derek." He shifted forward slightly. "I reached out to the legal aid office in Riverside last week. Their intake list is closed. They are not taking new clients until January." He had also tried 2 private attorneys in Corona. One had not returned his call. The other said she could not take the case before November at the earliest. He did not say what came next. He did not need to. November might be too late. "There is one more thing," Pastor Elwood said, and his discomfort showed in the way it always showed on good men, not dramatically, but plainly, like someone carrying a piece of news they had hoped they would not need to deliver. "I believe Derek has been intercepting more than the mail. Mrs. Henderson at the church tried to reach you 3 weeks ago about the harvest supper. She said a man picked up and told her you were resting and not to be disturbed." I looked at the telephone on the kitchen wall, the same one I had used for 15 years. "He answered my phone," I said. "I believe so," Pastor Elwood said. The 3 of us sat there while the October light moved slowly across the kitchen floor, and I felt the sensation of a man who has been standing in a room gradually filling with water, and has only just thought to look down at his feet. Ruthie got up to leave about an hour later. At the kitchen door she stopped and turned, and there was something deliberate in her face, something that had been decided. "Russell," she said, "there is something I need to show you. I have been holding on to it for a long time." Her voice caught just slightly at the edges, the way a voice does when it has been carrying weight for longer than it should have had to. "I am sorry it took me this long to bring it to you. I will come back tonight." She left before I could ask her what she meant. I stayed at the table after they had both gone. I looked at the telephone. I looked at the mail slot in the front door. I looked at my own hands. And I thought about water climbing slowly up the walls of a room, while the man inside it stands there, reading. I thought about all those mornings I had walked to the mailbox, barefoot on the cold concrete, before the coffee was even made, counting the days since Caleb had left. And I wondered for the first time, with any real urgency, whether any of those days had been what I believed them to be. Ruthie came back at 7 that evening. She was carrying a shoebox, not a gift box, just a worn, ordinary shoebox with a rubber band holding the lid flat and the corners gone soft from years of being picked up and set back down. The kind of box a person reaches for when they are keeping something they were never entirely sure was theirs to keep. She placed it on the kitchen table and sat across from me without taking off her coat, as though she was not yet certain this visit would go the way she was hoping. "Before I open this," she said, "I need to tell you something." Her palms were pressed to the top of the box, and her chin was level, the posture of a woman steadying herself for what she has to say. "I want you to hear all of it before you respond. Can you do that?" "Yes," I said. She drew a breath that was not quite steady at the top. "For about 10 years, she said, "I watched Constance take things from the mailbox and put them in the trash can at the end of the driveway. Not every day, but often enough that it registered. Bills, I thought. Advertisements. I told myself it was no business of mine how a woman managed her own household's correspondence." She paused. Her jaw tightened. "But some of those envelopes had a Seattle return address on them. I could read it from my own driveway when I went out to collect my mail. And after a time I began to think, what if they were not advertisements? What if they were something else?" She looked down at her hands resting on the lid. "So I started retrieving them from the trash after it was put out before the truck came around. I told myself I would check, and if they were nothing, I would put them back and no one would ever know." Her voice broke on that last word only slightly, and she pressed her lips together for a moment. "They were not nothing," she said. She lifted the rubber band, removed the lid, and turned the box around to face me. 23 envelopes stacked in order the way someone careful stacks things. Every one of them bore a Seattle return address. Every one of them had my name written across the front, in handwriting I had not laid eyes on in 4 years, but knew the way you know a voice on the telephone before the person tells you who they are. My hands moved toward the box without any decision on my part. I picked up the top envelope and held it, and my chest was doing something I had no clean word for. Something between breaking and opening, and those two things I have come to understand are not nearly so different as people tend to believe. "He never stopped writing," Ruthie said. Her eyes were full, and she made no effort to conceal it. "Russell, he never stopped. Not once." I opened the first envelope. 2 pages both sides lined the handwriting done by hand. The ink had gone pale with time, worn thin by however many years it had spent sealed in that box. The date placed it 3 weeks after Caleb had pulled away from Crestwood Mill Road, a suitcase in the back that was too light for everything a departure like that was supposed to mean. He described the apartment above the restaurant on Pike Street. He wrote about the evening fog moving in off the bay, and how it sent him back in his mind to those early mornings on Crestwood Mill Road, the marine layer settling low, the air carrying damp concrete and eucalyptus into everything. He wrote about a man named Dewey who found his own jokes funnier than anyone else did and couldn't manage a pot of beans no matter how hard he tried. He wrote about the sounds he missed the garage door, the particular groan of the third porch step. And then toward the bottom of that second page, the letters growing smaller, as though the weight of what he was trying to say kept pressing the words tighter together, he wrote, "The paper you gave me is with me everywhere I go. I take it out sometimes when things are hard and I read it and I think about coming home. I am not ready yet, but I want you to know that I think about it every single day. I think about you every single day, Dad. I just wanted you to know that." I could not go on. Something had locked in my throat. My eyes stung, and my hands had begun trembling so hard the pages knocked against one another. I had to lower the letter to the table and press my palms down flat against the wood and work through it the way you work through pain in the body, deliberately unhurried air drawn in through the nose and released through the mouth. Ruthie stretched her arms across the table and folded her hands over mine. "I am so sorry," she said, her voice catching at the edges. "Russell, I am so sorry I waited this long. I kept telling myself it was not my place. I kept telling myself the truth would reach you some other way. I should have knocked on your door sooner. I should have come years ago. Ruthie." The word came out worn and uneven, scraped bare by everything I was holding back behind it. You came. That is what matters. You came. She dipped her head. She was crying openly now, and she did not try to hide it. My eyes moved to the stack of envelopes still inside the shoebox. 23 letters. 4 years of his words aimed at me, dropped into a trash can at the end of this driveway, and pulled out again by a woman in her 60s who had spent years convincing herself it was none of her concern, before she finally stopped convincing herself. I asked about the last one, the one with the unfamiliar handwriting on the envelope. Ruthie gave a slow nod. I know. I watched Constance carry that one out to the outgoing mail herself. I lifted the letter off the table. My eyes found the final line one more time. I think about you every single day, Dad. Beyond the kitchen window, the garden had gone dark. The rose I had walked away from 3 years ago. The earth beneath it hardened and gray. Something moved in my chest when I looked out at it, not quite guilt, but something that lived next door to purpose. The feeling a person gets when the reason a thing once mattered comes back to them all at once. I did not sleep that night. Ruthie's shoebox stayed open on the kitchen table, and I worked through all 23 letters before the window behind me began to lighten. A few of them I read a second time. The handwriting shifted as the years moved forward, cramped and narrow, when he was worn down wider and easier, when life had given him something good. Somewhere in the middle of the stack, one letter had been written in pencil rather than ink, which meant he had written it wherever he happened to be, without a proper surface, without the small dignities a desk provides. A car maybe, a break room. The kind of place a person ends up when the need to say something is stronger than the circumstances around them. Every letter opened with my name, everyone closed the same way. Your son Caleb, your son. By the time the gray of early morning settled into the pale, thin light of an October day, my eyes felt raw, and my back had stiffened from the hours in that chair. What I had instead of sleep was a kind of clarity. The variety that arrives only after a long night spent awake, the kind that cuts everything away until only the actual truth is left standing. And the truth was plain. My son had sent letters for 4 years. My son had driven back to this house and been turned from the door while I sat 40 feet away with a book open in my hands. My son had never stopped thinking of me. And the next day, which was already today, which had already arrived, the people responsible for all that quiet were coming to strip this house from me. I brewed coffee. I held the mug and let the morning move in. Derek got there at 8:15 ahead of when I'd figured. He already had the key working in the lock before I registered the sound of the car, and he came through the door with Clifton Rowe at his back and 4 sheriff's deputies behind Clifton Rowe, each of them peeling off into corners of my kitchen and living room, the same way they'd done it before, doorways and edges claimed with the unhurried momentum of people who had run through this in their heads and were now simply finishing the motion. Constance entered last. She positioned herself in the kitchen corner, arms wrapped across her chest, eyes aimed somewhere past the room, the same stance she had held 22 years ago on the night of the storm, the night I carried Caleb in out of the rain. Same bearing, same studied refusal to let her gaze land on my face. Some things I thought hold their shape no matter what. Clifton Rowe set the documents on the table and walked through the placement order in that same careful, uninflected voice he'd used the first visit, the tone of someone who has decided that staying neutral is the same as staying clean. Derek took the chair across from me. His blue shirt had been pressed. His hands sat still on the tabletop. He had the look of a man who has repeated a justification to himself so many times that it has stopped feeling like a justification and started feeling like a fact. Dad, he said, I need you to sign the placement agreement today. I know you do. This doesn't have to go hard. It already has gone hard, Derek. I held his gaze across the table. This man, this boy I had steadied on a bicycle at the end of this same driveway. What I felt was a grief I hadn't had a name for until now. The grief of finding someone unrecognizable inside a face you know by heart. This has been hard for a long time. We just haven't said so out loud. His jaw went tight. He slid the peers across the table in my direction. Clifton Rowe drew a pen from somewhere and placed it on top of them. I looked at the pen. I thought about 23 letters in the shoebox sitting on the counter at my back. I thought about a sheet of paper folded into quarters, riding in a jacket pocket 400 miles north of where I was sitting. I thought about a young man who had made the drive back here once and been sent away by someone in this very room. No, I said. Something in Derek's face gave way at the seams. barely but enough to see like a structure that has been taking load for too long. Dad, the court has already... I caught that the first time, I said. The answer hasn't moved. He pushed back from the table and got to his feet. The chair legs dragged across the floor. You don't have a choice in this. A court order is not a suggestion. It is not something you get to refuse. I understand the document, I said. I'm still refusing it. One of the deputies near the door adjusted his footing. Clifton Rowe turned his attention back to his papers. Constance kept her eyes on the wall. Through the kitchen window, I could make out Ruthie standing at her fence phone against her ear, her other hand cutting through the air. The gesture of someone who keeps dialing and keeps getting nothing, and feels the urgency rising with each unanswered call. Derek pressed both hands to the table and brought his face closer to mine, his eyes carrying the look of a man whose patience has been fully spent and who is reaching for whatever comes after it. Dad. Then the sound arrived from the south, deep rhythmic building, growing the way it had grown the morning before when I first picked it up without understanding what I was hearing. But now the distance was gone, the window glass shivered in its frame, the corners of the papers on the table curled upward. The deputy who had been standing nearest the door moved out onto the porch, tilted his head back, and came back inside wearing an expression I had never once seen on someone in a uniform. Sir, he said, the professional steadiness completely gone from his voice. It is on the ground. Someone is getting out. Derek wheeled toward the window. The color drained from his face and left it the shade of weathered concrete. Constance's arms fell away from her chest and hung at her sides. I didn't move. I stayed at the kitchen table with both palms on the wood, my eyes on Ruthie's shoebox, sitting on the counter, turning over in my mind the memory of a boy who had promised he would find his way back. And I thought maybe he meant it after all. While I sat there refusing to touch that pen, something was already unfolding 40 miles to the south that I will spend whatever years I have left being grateful for. Caleb told me about it afterward, the way he told me most things, not in one sitting, but in the order he could bring himself to say it. I'm gonna tell it the way I came to understand it, because it belongs in this account as surely as anything that happened on Crestwood Mill Road. The conference room on the 28th floor of the Whitmore Innovation Group building on 5th Avenue held 14 people that Monday morning. Caleb sat at the head of a long glass table that mirrored the riverside skyline. Back at itself, everything looked polished and remote, nothing like a driveway at the edge of Cedar Hollow. The morning's agenda centered on a proposed acquisition. Meridian Capital LLC, says financial management firm, headquartered in Temecula, that had been under informal review for 6 weeks. Meridian handled fiduciary services for a client base that overlapped directly with Whitmore's small business platform users. The acquisition had been positioned as a natural extension, a way to fold integrated financial management into the tools Whitmore's clients already relied on. Meridian was not a large company. What it was a company that had built a specific and profitable operation around filing conservatorship petitions at the Riverside County Superior Court, petitions that, on closer examination by Nadia Fenton's team, had begun to reveal a pattern of procedural irregularities too consistent to be accidental. Nadia stood at the front of the room, reading glasses on her legal pad, covered in the small, tight handwriting she used when she was working through something she hadn't yet fully resolved. She was on page 34 of the due diligence report. The Meridian file has one category of concern I want to flag before we go further, she said, in the tone she used when something was not a suggestion but a directive wearing polite clothing. Their court filing history includes several conservatorship petitions currently in active enforcement status. Our team has identified irregularities in the supporting documentation across at least 6 of them. If we complete this acquisition while those filings remain active, the legal liability transfers to Whitmore. How significant is the exposure? Someone at the table asked. Significant enough that I would not recommend closing until the active cases are resolved or the flawed filings are withdrawn, Nadia said. She turned to the next page. I'm going to read the active case list so the board understands specifically what we are talking about. She read 4 names, then she read a 5th, Russell Grady, 14 Crestwood Mill Road, Cedar Hollow, California. Conservatorship petition filed by Derek Grady. Temporary order granted September 19th. Enforcement action scheduled for this morning. Caleb was working through a separate document at the far end of the table, pen in hand, eyes down, writing his name, when Nadia said, 14 Crestwood Mill Road. His pen stopped. Nadia looked up from the report. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms do when something has shifted and nobody yet knows what it is. Caleb, she said, not Mr. Grady, which was what she called him in meetings. Caleb, look at this. He set the pen down. The ink had continued to bleed from the nib where it rested against the paper, spreading into a small, dark circle on the signature line of a document worth considerably more than the house on Crestwood Mill Road. He didn't seem to notice. He got to his feet. He crossed to the window that faced Fifth Avenue and stood there a moment with his back to the room, and the 14 people at the table watched him in silence because something in the way he held his shoulders told them clearly that speaking was not what this moment called for. Then his hand went to the inside pocket of his jacket. He drew out a piece of paper, folded in four, folded so many times, and for so long, that the creases had gone white, and the paper itself had softened at the edges, the way things soften when they've been taken out and handled 10,000 times by hands that needed to confirm something was still there. He unfolded it carefully, the deliberate care of a person afraid of tearing something that cannot be replaced. He spread it on the conference table beside Nadia's open report. He put one finger on the address printed in the report, then on the address written in pencil on his piece of paper, written in handwriting that wasn't his, in letters composed by a man with grease still on his hands on a June afternoon 4 years ago. 14. Crestwood Mill Road, Cedar Hollow, California, just in case. 2 addresses, 1 piece of paper, 22 years. The pen was still on the table, its ink spreading slowly outward from where it had come to rest. Nadia didn't need it explained. She was already on her phone speaking quickly and quietly to the firm's emergency litigations contact at the Riverside County Superior Court, laying out the grounds for an emergency motion to stay the enforcement action currently underway at the above address. Under California Code of Civil Procedure, an emergency motion to stay could be filed and ruled on within the same day when immediate and irreparable harm could be demonstrated. Fraudulent documentation in support of a conservatorship order qualified. The flawed psychiatric evaluation qualified. The forged power of attorney qualified. She had filed before Caleb reached the door. He stopped in the doorway and turned back to face the room. 14 people looked at him. The riverside skyline held still behind the glass, clean and far away. "Cancel everything on today's calendar," he said. His voice carried the particular steadiness that belongs to someone who has made a decision so complete there is no space left inside it for doubt. "Call the heliport. Nadia, bring the full Meridian file. You're coming with me." Someone at the board table mentioned that the acquisition still had unresolved points. Caleb looked at that person for one moment. "There is a 22-year-old debt that comes due this morning," he said. "Everything else will wait." He walked out. Nadia gathered her files and followed without a word. And if you knew Nadia Fenton at all, you understood that her following without a word meant she believed every syllable of what he had just said. I heard it before I could see it. Everyone in that kitchen heard it. The sound came up from the south, low and steady, and building not that the way thunder spreads outward in all directions, but the way it builds when it is fixed on one particular place and is dropping toward it without hesitation. Derek moved to the window. First then, Clifton Rowe. One of the deputies stepped out onto the porch and raised a hand to shade his eyes from the morning light and looked up. The expression he wore when he turned back was the expression of a man who has just understood that the situation he is standing in is considerably larger than the paperwork described. The helicopter came in low over the tree line on the south side of Crestwood Mill Road. It was not a small machine. It was the kind of aircraft corporations deploy when they need people moved fast and want everyone watching to understand that the people inside are not without consequence. Along its side in clean white lettering against a dark hull was the name Whitmore. It crossed the fence line and settled into the open lot to the west of the property, the vacant parcel that old Mr. Hicks had left unmowed for 30 years, which had made it the widest flat stretch of ground on this end of Crestwood Mill Road. The rotor wash pushed through the kitchen window like something solid, scattering the papers on the table, rattling the cups on their hooks, catching the corners of the placement agreement I had refused to sign and sending it sliding off the table onto the floor. No one moved to retrieve it. The engine wound down. The blades lost their rhythm. A stillness settled over the yard that felt unlike the stillness before it. Denser, more deliberate. The stillness of something that has landed and is waiting on what comes next. The cabin door swung open. The man who stepped out was in his early 20s, dark jacket, no tie, moving with that quality of unhurried calm that belongs to people who have learned that urgency signals uncertainty. Behind him came a woman with blonde hair and a thick file case tucked under her arm, moving with the brisk, directed energy of someone who has already worked out what must happen and is eager to get on with it. The man drew up at the edge of the yard. His gaze swept the scene in front of him, measured, unhurried, the kind of looking that takes full stock of a situation before it commits to anything. He noted the 4 sheriff's vehicles lined along the road and the driveway. He took in the deputies positioned around the yard. He looked at Clifton Rowe. He looked at Derek, whose color had drained to something close to ash, both hands locked around the porch railing. He looked at Constance, who had pushed herself back against the kitchen wall. Then his eyes found me. I was out on the porch steps. I had come outside when the helicopter set down, because there are moments when staying inside feels like a kind of cowardice, like refusing to bear witness to something that has traveled a great distance, specifically to be witnessed. I was standing on the 3rd step, the one that had groaned under any weight for 15 years, looking at this man. I could not recognize him, this stranger in a dark jacket crossing my yard with 22 years stretched between us like a field gone to seed. He passed Derek without a glance. He walked past Clifton Rowe the same way. He came on across the yard and stopped at the foot of the porch steps and looked up at me, and I looked down at him, and I was searching his face for something familiar, finding fragments of it, but unable to pull them into anything I could be sure of. And then he went down on one knee on the bottom step and said it. "Dad, don't worry. I'm home." 3 words. That was all. I stood on that step and felt 22 years land in my chest all at once. Not slowly, not in installments, all of it, the full accumulated weight of every morning I had walked out to the mailbox. Every evening I had passed the closed door of his room. Every time my eyes had gone to that shoebox of letters. Every night I had told myself he had moved on, and that was fine, because I had raised him to move on. 22 years. I could not speak. I could not move. I stood with my hands at my sides and my throat shut tight. I looked at his face. This face I did not know, and I searched it, and then I found what I had been looking for. Not in the jaw or the forehead or the set of the mouth, in the eyes. The same dark eyes with that same slight downward pull at the outer corners, the ones I had looked at across the breakfast table for 18 years, and across the blunt silence of absence for 4 more. My hand moved before I told it to. I reached out and laid my palm against his face. This man kneeling on my porch step, this stranger who was no stranger. His eyes closed, and he turned his face into my hand, the way he had once turned it into my shoulder the morning the black car came and took him away. I felt his jaw working against my palm as he tried to hold himself together and lost the effort and lost it completely and did not seem to mind. "Caleb," I said. My voice came apart as I said it, broken into pieces by everything pressing behind it. "Caleb." He stood. He was taller than I had carried him in my memory, or I had let the scale of him blur over the years, or time itself had rearranged something in the distance between us. He stood, eyes wet, jaw set, in that way it had always set itself when he was resolved not to be undone by a moment. And he turned to face the yard and everyone in it. Beyond the fence, Ruthie Alton had both hands pressed over her mouth. Her shoulders were moving with something that was not sorrow. Caleb looked at Clifton Rowe. When his voice came, it was steady in the way that steadiness has a price behind it. "Mr. Rowe," he said, "my name is Caleb Grady. I am the acting chairman of Whitmore Innovation Group, and I need you to look at something before anyone in this yard takes another step." Nadia Fenton came up behind him and opened the file case, and the morning light fell across 40 pages of documentation that were about to take Derek Grady's carefully constructed plan apart 1 paragraph at a time. Caleb did not raise his voice once in the 2 hours that followed. I noticed that. I noticed it because I was sitting on the porch step beside him the entire time, close enough to feel the steadiness coming off him like warmth. And I understood that this particular kind of quiet was not the quiet of a man holding something back. It was the quiet of a man who has already arrived somewhere completely without reservation and has nothing left to demonstrate to anyone in the yard. He sat beside me on the step and let Nadia work. She opened her laptop on the porch railing and pulled up the Riverside County Superior Court's public records portal, accessible to any member of the public with a case number and a browser. And she began working through the conservatorship file that Derek had spent 4 months assembling, page by page, in the calm and methodical manner of someone who has found exactly what she expected to find and is simply mapping the full extent of it. Clifton Rowe stood 5 feet away. He had stopped consulting his own documents and was watching Nadia's screen with the look of a man beginning to grasp the precise shape of the trouble he had walked into. "Psychiatric evaluation," Nadia said without looking up. "Submitted by Dr. Arnold Pinkett, dated August 3rd. She opened the California Medical Board's license verification portal in a second window. It took 11 seconds. Dr. Pinkett's license to practice psychiatry in California expired July 23rd. That is 11 days before the date on this evaluation. She looked up at Clifton Rowe over the top of the laptop. "The evaluation was backdated, Mr. Rowe. On the date printed at the top of this document, Dr. Pinkett was not legally permitted to produce it." Clifton Rowe's face did something complicated. He looked at Derek. Derek was looking at the porch railing. "Durable power of attorney," Nadia continued, "submitted as supporting documentation for the conservatorship petition." She drew a second document from her file case, a photocopy of Russell Grady's signature card from his bank account obtained that morning, with the cooperation of the branch manager on Magnolia Avenue, who had been uneasy about the restricted access order from the start, and was readily willing to furnish records once an attorney with a legitimate legal basis made the request. The signature on the power of attorney does not match the signature on file at the bank. The letter formation is different, the pressure points are different, the overall slant is different. She set both documents on the porch railing side by side. "This is a forgery." One of the deputies had drawn closer without appearing to move. He was standing at the base of the porch steps now, arms at his sides, reading over Nadia's shoulder, and the expression on his face had traveled a long way from the professional neutrality he had carried in with him. Derek made a sound that fell short of being a word. Constance had pressed herself into the corner of the porch, with her arms wound so tightly across her chest that her knuckles had gone white. Caleb rose from the step beside me. He went into the kitchen and came back carrying Ruthie's shoebox. He set it on the porch railing between the laptop and the bank documents and lifted the lid. 23 letters, he said. His voice was level and quiet, and something underneath the levelness was costing him. Written over 4 years. Every one of them sent to this address. Every one of them pulled from the mailbox before my father could see them. He looked at Derek for the first time since the helicopter had landed, a long, flat look that held no trace of anger and everything of finality. Under California Welfare and Institutions Code, Section 15610-30, the deliberate isolation of a person 65 years of age or older from family contact, combined with financial exploitation, constitutes elder financial abuse with aggravating circumstances. Derek opened his mouth, then closed it. "I am not a prosecutor," Caleb said. "I am not here to argue with you. I am here because 40 minutes ago I was sitting in a conference room 40 miles from this house, and I read my father's address in a court document, and I got on a helicopter." He lifted one of the envelopes from the shoebox and held it up not as a threat, simply as a fact, so that every person standing in that yard could see it. "These letters establish a pattern. My attorney filed an emergency motion with the Superior Court this morning, laying out the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation and the forged power of attorney. The motion was granted before this helicopter touched down." He set the envelope back in the box. Nadia's phone rang. She checked the screen, answered with 2 words, listened for 15 seconds, then lowered it. "The temporary conservatorship order is suspended pending full evidentiary review. We have confirmation from the court clerk." The yard went very still. Clifton Rowe studied the document spread across the porch railing for a long moment. Then he straightened, cleared his throat, and addressed the deputy closest to the steps. "I need to advise my client to halt all enforcement activities immediately pending legal review of the supporting documentation," he said in the voice of a man making a calculation that will cost him a retainer but not his license. He did not look at Derek when he said it. "I would also strongly recommend that your office contact the county district attorney." The senior deputy gave a slow nod. He turned to the 3 officers positioned around the yard and offered a single brief nod, the kind that means "stand down," without those words being spoken aloud. The others eased out of their stances in increments the way trained people do. Not all at once, but enough that the air shifted. The pressure that all those uniformed bodies had been pressing into that small kitchen released like a valve being opened. Derek's hands came away from the railing. He stepped back once, then again, the small retreating movements of a man searching for a position that no longer exists. His face had cycled through several expressions in the past 10 minutes and had arrived at something that was neither guilt nor defiance but lived in the space between them. The look of a man who has exhausted every prepared response and is standing exposed for the first time. Constance had not left her corner of the porch. Her gaze had settled on the shoebox, sitting on the railing with the 23 envelopes visible inside, and her face was doing absolutely nothing, which was worse than any expression it might have worn. I was still on the porch step. Caleb settled back down beside me. Neither of us spoke right away. And this was not the silence that had once lived between us like a wound, because it was not the silence of people with nothing left to say. It was the silence of people with far too much to say who are choosing for this one moment simply to sit beside one another and breathe the same morning air and let what has happened settle into its place. His shoulder rested against mine, the same shoulder, the same porch as it had been after school. In the driveway on summer evenings up here at the kitchen table. On the morning I told him to go further than this place had to offer. I put my hand on his arm. He covered it with his. The law is a slow machine. It does not apologize for its slowness. It does not explain the days it requires to move or account for the weight it gathers as it goes. It simply moves, and when it finally turns in the right direction, it carries the full mass of everything it has been holding. Those standing in its path discover quickly that there is no graceful way to be struck by it. The temporary conservatorship order was formally vacated by the Riverside County Superior Court 4 days after that Monday morning. Nadia filed the full evidentiary package that same afternoon, the backdated psychiatric evaluation, the forged power of attorney, alongside the signature comparison, the 23 letters documenting a sustained and deliberate pattern of isolation, and the Meridian Capital connection that had brought the entire structure into the light. The judge reviewed the file and signed the revocation order before 5:00. Derek and Constance were served with notice of a criminal investigation. The following Thursday, the Riverside County District Attorney's Office filed charges under California Welfare and Institutions Code, Section 15610, Elder Financial Abuse, and California Penal Code, Section 470, Forgery. Clifton Rowe, consistent with the decision he had made on that porch Monday morning, provided investigators with a full account of his involvement and agreed to cooperate with the prosecution. It would cost him his relationship with Derek and his retainer, but not his license, which was the calculation he had made, and one I will not judge him for, because I have made my own calculations across the years, and not all of them were clean. Dr. Arnold Pinkett surrendered what remained of his license voluntarily, and accepted a separate referral to the medical board's disciplinary committee. The notary in Hemet, who had processed the forged power of attorney, was referred to the California Secretary of State's Office for License Review and cooperated, fully producing records confirming that the signature had been presented by Constance Grady, without Russell Grady, present a fact that added a further count to the charges already filed. Meridian Capital LLC was acquired by Whitmore Innovation Group on amended terms that included a clause drafted personally by Caleb, marked non-negotiable by Nadia, requiring the immediate withdrawal of all pending conservatorship petitions filed under Meridian's facilitation. 4 families in Riverside County had their cases dismissed in the same week. I did not follow the legal proceedings closely after that. Caleb had people for that, and Nadia was the best of them, and I had other things to attend to. The most important thing was the house. My bank account was unfrozen within 48 hours of the court order. I drove to the branch on Magnolia Avenue on a Wednesday morning and walked up to the same teller who had told me 2 months earlier that she was very sorry, but she was not able to override the restricted access order. She looked at her screen, then at me and said, "Mr. Grady, your account has been fully restored. Is there anything I can help you with today?" I withdrew $200. The water pump for the truck had been waiting long enough. Caleb stayed through the week. He slept in his old room, in a bed that was too small for him, now his feet hanging off the end, and he never once mentioned it. In the mornings, I heard him moving around in the kitchen before I was up making coffee the way I had taught him. 2 scoops, not 3, because 3 makes it bitter. The sound of another person moving through the house at 6 in the morning was something I had not known I was still grieving until I had it back. Pastor Elwood stopped by Wednesday afternoon and sat on the porch with us and drank his coffee without remarking on its quality, which from him was the highest form of praise. He watched Caleb for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "I prayed for this, specifically for this. I want you both to know that." Caleb looked at him. How long? Since the night your father called me, Pastor Elwood said. 22 years, give or take. Caleb's jaw moved. He gave one nod toward the yard, pressed his lips together, and I watched him take that in the way you take in something that is both a gift and a burden arriving in the same moment. Ruthie came over Thursday morning with bean seeds in a brown paper envelope. She set them on the kitchen table without any fanfare and said, "I thought the garden could use something to look forward to." Then she sat and drank her coffee and talked about her sister in Spokane, and did not once mention the shoebox or the letters or any part of what she had carried quietly for 10 years. Because Ruthie understood that some things require no further discussion once they have been resolved. They only need to be set down and left where they land. That evening Caleb and I stood together in the doorway of his old room. The door was open, the bed was made. The books were on the shelf in the same order they'd held since he was 18, and walked out the front door with a suitcase too light for what the leaving meant. "You kept it," he said. I had been looking at the room. I turned and looked at him instead. "Every single day, Paut," I said. His throat moved. He looked back at the room, then at the floor, then at the room again. He was doing the thing he had always done when something reached him harder than he had braced for, searching for a fixed point to hold on to, while the feeling ran its course. "I thought you had moved on," he said, "when the letters stopped, when Derek told me when he said you'd moved on. I thought I was right to believe I was easy to leave behind." My chest ached with a particular and familiar pain. "Caleb," I said, "look at that room." He looked. "Does that look like a man who moved on?" He didn't answer right away. He stood in the doorway of the room where he had grown up 22 years old with everything he had built and everything he had lost, and everything he had recovered that morning, all held inside him at once. His eyes went bright and wet, and he made no effort to conceal it. "No," he said, "it does not." I put my hand on his shoulder. He laid his hand over mine. We stood together in the hallway of the house on Crestwood Mill Road, father and son looking at the room that had waited while the evening light came through the window at the far end of the hall and drew a long stripe of gold across the floor. And outside in the yard, the garden was waiting, too patient and dark and ready. We started on the garden a Saturday morning in late October, 3 weeks after everything had settled back into place. Ruthie brought the bean seeds she had left sitting on the kitchen table, the same brown paper envelope, no label, the kind that tells you the seeds came from someone's own garden rather than off a store shelf. Pastor Elwood arrived in his old planting gloves, the leather pair with the cracked knuckles that he'd owned since before I had moved to Crestwood Mill Road. Caleb drove out to the hardware store in Cedar Hollow and came back with a new shovel because he said the old one had been standing against the barn wall long enough to have earned its retirement. He said it with the particular careful lightness of a man making a small joke, because the other option is feeling everything too fully all at once. The morning was cool and clear, the kind of October morning that California occasionally produces as something like an apology for the summer that preceded it. The light came in low and gold, and the air smelled of damp soil and eucalyptus, and carried the specific sweetness of things that are drawing to a good close. We worked mostly without talking the way people work when the labor itself is the conversation. Caleb turned the earth with the new shovel, while Ruthie and I broke up the clumps with our hands, and Pastor Elwood ran the hose along the far row, dampening the soil before the seeds went in. The ground had stiffened in the years I had left it untended, but it had not gone dead. Beneath the crust, it was still dark and rich soil that remembers what it was made for, and will return to it the moment someone gives it attention again. "You're doing that wrong," I told Caleb at one point, watching him work a row. He looked up. "I looked it up," he said. "Online, 3 sources." "The internet doesn't know this soil," I said. "Plant them a hand's width deeper and angle them toward the south. From October, on the afternoon sun comes in at a slant here." He looked at me, then at the row, then pulled the seedling back up and replanted it the way I had said. And he offered no further defense of the 3 sources, which told me more about how much he had grown than anything else that happened that morning. Ruthie laughed from the far end of the row. She had a laugh that began low and gathered as it went, the kind that pulls other people into it before they know what they're laughing about. Pastor Elwood joined in. Even Caleb's mouth pulled sideways into something that stopped just short of a full smile, but was close enough to count. By midday the rows were laid in, and the seeds were down, and the hose had made its full circuit, and the 4 of us settled onto the porch steps in the thin October sun, with whatever had been brought for lunch, which turned out to be a partial overlap of Ruthie's sandwiches, Pastor Elwood's thermos of coffee, and a bag of chips Caleb had picked up at the hardware store alongside the shovel. After Ruthie and Pastor Elwood left that afternoon, Caleb and I remained on the porch in the quiet they had left behind them. The yard carried the particular piece of a place where work has just been finished, and the results haven't yet appeared, but the potential is in the ground and real. I went inside and came back with the wooden box. I set it on the step between us and opened the lid. Caleb looked at what was inside the flannel blanket gone soft with age that I had found him wrapped in the yellow baby blanket, the folded note in a stranger's handwriting. "Please take care of my son." And the letter with the wrong handwriting, the one Derek had written, and that I had believed for 4 years. Caleb picked up the letter with the wrong handwriting. He read it. I watched his jaw go tight and then release the physical effort of moving through something without letting it pull him down. Then he folded it carefully, set it back inside the box, and said nothing about Derek or Constance because there was nothing left to say about either of them that the events of that week had not already said more plainly than words could manage. He reached into his jacket pocket. He drew out the piece of paper that had lived there for 4 years, folded in 4, worn soft. At the creases, the penciled address almost but not quite faded. He unfolded it slowly and held it flat in his palm so I could see it. 14 Crestwood Mill Road, Cedar Hollow, California, just in case. He set it in the box beside the note that had begun everything. 2 pieces of paper, 2 requests carried across time by people trying to trust that whoever was on the other end would hold. "Please take care of my son, just in case." Both had been answered. I looked at them lying side by side in the wooden box, and I felt something settle in my chest that had not been settled in a very long time. Not happiness. Exactly, happiness is too light a word for something that carries this much weight behind it. Something closer to the feeling of a door that has been standing open in a draft for years, finally being properly closed. Not shut, closed. There is a difference. One keeps things out. The other simply lets the room be warm. "I always knew you would come back," I said. Caleb turned to look at me. "How?" he asked. I looked at the box, at the flannel blanket and the yellow blanket and the note and the letter and the 2 pieces of paper lying side by side. "Because I never put it away," I said. He looked at the box for a long moment. Then he looked at me. His eyes were bright and he was not going to cry. And I was not going to cry either, because we had both done enough of that in the past 3 weeks to last us a reasonable while, and because sometimes the right response to something true is not tears, but simply the acknowledgement of it, the quiet placing of it into the record of a life that has been shared. He nodded once slowly, the nod of a man filing something away in the part of himself where the things that matter are kept. The afternoon light moved across the yard, long and gold, the way October light moves when it is in no particular hurry. The new rows of turned earth ran straight and dark from the porch to the fence, waiting for what we had put into them to become what it was going to become. A bean plant does not show itself for weeks after it goes into the ground. You water it, and you wait, and you trust the soil to do what soil does when it is tended and given the right conditions. You do not dig it back up to check. You simply hold the belief that what you planted is growing even when there is no evidence yet above the surface, and eventually the evidence arrives, and you find that the believing was the whole of the work. I have thought about that a great deal since that October morning on the porch. I have thought about what it means to tend something across 22 years of silence and distance and loss, and the specific grief of not knowing whether what you are tending has survived. I have thought about the wooden box kept under the bed and never put away, and the piece of paper folded in 4 in a jacket pocket, taken out and unfolded 10,000 times in hotel rooms and highway rest stops and quiet offices in the dark. I have come to believe that what holds a promise together across that kind of distance is not certainty. You cannot be certain across 22 years. You cannot know. You can only keep the box. You can only keep the paper in your pocket. That is the only way it works with a rose. Give it water each morning. Trust what you cannot see. Return the following day and do the same. Then one morning, something green breaks the surface and you understand that all the faithfulness was never wasted. Caleb held on through the last days of October. On a Sunday, he pointed the truck toward Riverside, the one he'd picked up in Cedar Hollow, because he told me a rental never felt right on Crestwood Mill Road, and he made the drive home. When he got there, he phoned me. That was something I had pressed on him since he was small. Let me know when you're safe. Somewhere in all those silent years between us, he had held on to it, and I decided not to pull that thread too hard because certain things are better received than picked apart. After he left, I walked my usual round of the property. As the evening came down, the barn door latch, the bucket by the pump, the path back inside, I came to rest in the kitchen the way I had done for 22 years, taking stock of what remained. The wooden box rested on the table, where the two of us had set it earlier that day, the two pieces of paper lying inside it, one next to the other. The new shovel stood propped against the kitchen wall, where Caleb had leaned it before pulling out of the drive, still unmarked by use store sticker, still fixed to the handle, right where he'd left it without thinking to peel it off. I stood there looking at that shovel, then at the box, then at the window, over the sink where the garden showed itself faintly in the last thin light of the evening. My mind went to a cotton quilt in a wicker market basket sitting on a wet porch, and to tiny fingers finding one of mine and holding on, and to a boy who became a man and left and then came back on the precise morning it counted. And I found myself thinking that Constance had told me the truth 22 years ago, right here in this kitchen, when she said that taking that child in would alter the shape of everything. What she had not foreseen was the direction of that change. I switched off the light and walked to my room, and for the first time in more years than I could honestly name, I left the door unlocked behind me. The old house spoke its usual language in the dark pipe's rafters, the third porch steps settling against the cooling night. Beyond the walls, the garden held itself in the October darkness, still and unhurried, and waited with everything we had worked into it. That is where this story finally rests. Not in the courtroom, not on the porch, but in a quiet kitchen, with an unlocked door and a garden waiting in the dark. This road costs more than I can add up in a single telling. Years of silence that did not have to be. Letters that never arrived. A boy who came back once and was turned away by a door I never knew had opened. I believe God kept a thread between us, through all of it thin as it was, because Caleb found his way back on the one morning it could not have waited another day. That is not luck. That is something older than luck. If this family revenge story has stayed with you, here is what I hope you carry out of it. Do not assume silence means acceptance. A person can stop knocking without ever stopping to care. If someone you love goes quiet, reach because the door may have been closed by hands that were not yours. Paper can be forged and signatures can be copied, but the truth of a relationship lives in things no one can file with a court. And for those of us who are adults, 50 plus, and have learned to read the warning signs of a failing machine, apply that same attention to the people around you. Deception announces itself if you are paying close enough attention. If this story settled something in, you leave a thought in the comments. I read them, and they matter to me more than you might think. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you want more stories told this way, with nothing held back, subscribe to Honor Revenge Stories. I will be here. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. Take good care of yourself.